Are humans naturally monogamous or polyamorous? Hey everybody, in this video, I'm going to be discussing what truly is the relationship style that is natural to humans. And I can tell you this is an age-old debate. This debate has been happening for a long time, but recently it's been back in the public discourse, so to speak, because some prominent spiritual figures have come out in favor of polyamory. And this has created quite the debate amongst people about what really is right, what is a human's true nature. And so we're going to break it down in this video. But before I do that, please make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Doing so greatly helps this channel. It helps the algorithms know that you like this content, you want to see more content. I am constantly suppressed by YouTube, so the more that you do that, if you like this content, the more of this content you'll see, and the more other people will see it as well, and I really appreciate that. I am Kevin Anthony, and I am a certified sexologist, Tantra Counselor, NLP Practitioner, and sex, love, and relationship coach. And for over a decade, I have been helping men, women, and couples have the relationship of their dreams and the best sex of their lives. Okay, so let's dive right in. There are really strong opinions on both sides, and there are some interesting arguments to be made for both sides. This is a topic that I was very interested in quite a few years ago. I spent a considerable amount of time researching it and reading about it. There are a couple of great books that I've read on it that I recommend. One here is called Sex at Dawn. That was a very interesting book. There's another one here called The Red Queen. I read these books a decade or more ago, now probably 15-ish, maybe even 20-ish years ago. I don't remember exactly when. The Red Queen, I think, was probably 20 years ago. Anyway, they had some really interesting research and theories in there. And so when it comes to, is mankind naturally monogamous or polyamorous, the answer really is it depends. I know most people would like to hear that there's a very cut and dry answer and it's just this, it's always this. This is the way it always has been and the way it always should be. And there are people that believe that, but that's just not what the research shows. So humans really are the ultimate adapters. We can adapt to pretty much anything. We can eat pretty much anything. We can live pretty much anywhere. We can live in pretty much any environment. So we are really good at adapting to the circumstances in which we live. And because of that, you see wide variation. So if we just take the example of, what food should we eat? Should we be vegetarians or should we be primarily meat eaters? And you can see really good arguments on both sides for why this one is good or why that one is good. But the reality is there is no one right way for everybody. Different people's bodies react differently to different types of diets. But in general, the human body can do both. It can be a meat eater. It can also be a vegetarian. Again, we're the ultimate adapters. And so when we look at humanity throughout history, what do we see? Well, we see examples of societies throughout history that were both primarily mono and primarily poly. There are many examples of how social class was a factor. There are examples of how, wealthy people throughout history tended to be more poly. If you were a king or a nobleman or, some position of wealth and power, you tended to have multiple wives often. However, if you tended to be part of one of the poorer classes, you tended, if you had, a husband or wife at all, you generally had one. And the reason for that, at least one of the reasons posited by some of these books, is it really had to do with opportunity. So in cases where humans had opportunity to have more than one, they generally did. And in cases where they didn't have that opportunity, they generally didn't, right? So if we come back to that idea of the ultimate adapter, right? It was adapting to, what was available in their particular time and society. So if we want to look back at history, we can't say, well, it's always been like this, or here it's always been like that. It has varied significantly across time and culture. And so it's hard to draw any real solid conclusions based on history. So if history doesn't necessarily give us the answer, what about, say, genetics? What does that say? Well, again, according to some of the research, you will read things like, well, women have a vested interest in being mono because they have to birth and raise children. And especially in past history, that was a risky proposition. So she needed a man to stick around to provide for her, to protect her, to provide food, right? Things like that. That would ensure a much higher level of success in children surviving, right? So being born, surviving, and then thriving, of course. You will also read that men have this predisposition to basically want to spread their genes far and wide to as many as possible. And a lot of people have taken that to mean, well, men are inherently poly and women are inherently mono. And that's not necessarily true either, even though those are some basic instincts at a genetic level. They're not the full story. So it's important not to attach to that and say, well, men, their whole goal is to just, spread their seed. So therefore every man is naturally poly. Or, you wouldn't say the other as well. You wouldn't say, well, women, have a vested interest in the success of their offspring, so therefore, they're always going to be mono. It's not necessarily the case. Those things are there. They are in our DNA. They may affect how we approach things to some extent, but again, I still don't think they're the full story. So if history doesn't really give us the answer, and the genetics don't necessarily give us an answer either, how do we decide which is really the best? Well, again, I mentioned that humans are the ultimate adapters. And it is really my belief that what is best depends on what your goals are. So let's look at some of the positives and negatives of both of these styles. And then you can see, well, okay, my goal maybe is to do this, and this is the system that would work best for me. Whereas, somebody else might say, my goal is to do this, and this is the system that would work best for me. So let's start with some of the positives of polyamory. Well, one, you have to learn a high level of skills to successfully navigate a polyamorous relationship. Now, if we're going back in history and we're talking about, some king or, high level, person in society, they didn't really need high level skills because, the women were most likely compelled to be with them as sort of a form of slavery. But in more modern times, if you want to successfully have a polyamorous relationship, you need to learn really good skills. You have to have a high level of emotional maturity. You have to learn really effective communication. You have to learn how to resolve disputes quickly and effectively. You have to learn to control jealousy. Like all of the really high level relationship skills really need to be there. Now, they should be there in a monogamous relationship also, but you can often get away with less skills in a monogamous relationship because it's just a less complicated relationship. As soon as you bring extra people in, you've got exponentially more dynamics, right? So in a monogamous relationship, you've got one person, second person, and then the dynamic created between the two. Now, if you add one extra person, you've got one person, two person, three person. You've got a dynamic between these two, a dynamic between these two, a dynamic between these two, right? Then the dynamic of the whole. So it gets exponentially more complicated, and therefore you really need higher level skills. And so one of the positives of poly is if you're successful in it, you have learned some pretty significant relationship skills, or you wouldn't be successful. Okay, a second benefit of a polyamorous relationship is that one person doesn't have to meet all of your needs. So a common complaint that you'll often hear when doing coaching work with couples is there's some need that one of the two people has that the other person isn't really able to meet. And that could be for a lot of reasons. It could be physically they can't, maybe because they're older. It could be because they really don't want to. It's something that is either not appealing to them or possibly triggering or traumatizing to them. And so in those situations, generally one person has to let go of that need because there's not a way for their partner to meet it. Now, sometimes there are healthy ways that they can get that need met outside of the relationship that aren't a form of cheating or a way that makes the other person uncomfortable or jealous. But sometimes there just isn't any way, and therefore you just need to compromise. But in a polyamorous relationship, you can potentially get all of your needs met by finding people that meet the needs that need meeting. Another possible positive of a poly relationship is that some relationships become sexless for various reasons. And often, not always, but often it's like one person has a problem. Either they've, had a physical problem or an emotional problem or whatever it is. They're just not interested in sex anymore. But they might still love the person and they might still want to be in relationship with them, but they just aren't interested in the sexual piece. The problem comes in is when the other person is still interested in the sexual piece. But it's like, okay, now we're together. We love each other. We don't want to get separated. But there's a big piece of our relationship missing. What do we do about it? And so in some instances, opening the relationship up to poly can be a way for the person who still does have a desire and interest in having a healthy, functioning sex life to get that need met. Now, it's not simple, and it can sometimes be a bit tricky, but it is a way that sometimes you can make those situations work. And one more positive of a poly is that it is a way that you can often get fantasies that you have met. So, sometimes in monogamous relationships, you might have a fantasy. Like the most common fantasy for men is a threesome, right? Well, how do you fulfill that fantasy in the context of a monogamous relationship? Well, generally you can't, right? And so in a poly relationship, if you have fantasies or things like that you really want fulfilled, you can generally make that happen. Now, it's not necessarily simple in a poly relationship either, but it is at least possible. So those are a few examples of some positive things that can come from having a polyamorous relationship. But it's not all just positives, because next we're going to talk about the negatives. Okay, some of the negatives of being in a poly relationship. More people creates a more complex dynamic. As I mentioned earlier, the more people you bring into this situation, the more complex the dynamics get, the more potential there is for conflict amongst the individuals. So it can really make things significantly more challenging. And if you're one of those people that doesn't like to spend a lot of time working on your relationship and, processing things that are going on, or emotions or dynamics or situations, then this really is not the style for you, because there is a significantly higher potential for the need to do that. And, for a lot of people, that's not really something they really want to spend a lot of time on. They want to create a stable relationship and, honestly, a lot of people just get on autopilot, which is not good either, by the way. It's one of the downsides to monogamous relationships. But they don't want to have to be putting extra effort in. Another negative of poly relationships is, to be honest, most people just do not have the skills to properly navigate it. They just don't. It takes a significant amount of skill, as I mentioned earlier, to really be able to do it properly without causing what they call in the poly world polyagony, right? Instead of polyamory, which is like you're in this poly relationship, right? Because it's supposed to be about many loves, right? And expanding love. And yet you're miserable because there's constant conflict and, stuff that needs to be processed and emotions and hurt feelings and things like that. And then lastly, of course, there is jealousy. Jealousy is a big issue when it comes to poly relationships, and it's something that can really rear its ugly head and create a lot of problems. And jealousy isn't always necessarily rational. A lot of times people say, well, let's just look at this rationally. Okay, boom, 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 boom. Here are the facts. And it's like, it doesn't really matter what the facts are when your jealousy gets triggered. Facts often go out the window. And so that can really be a significant hurdle. Now, that can exist in monogamous relationships as well, but definitely the potential is a lot higher in polyamorous relationships. Next, let's look at some positives of monogamous relationships. Number one is that they are typically more stable. It is a less complex type of arrangement. It's also one that more people are familiar with. It's kind of the default mode for most people. It's the one that they generally grew up around and witnessing. So it feels more comfortable and normal to them. And so they do tend to typically be more stable. And next, because they are typically more stable, they feel safer for most people. They feel a lot safer when they know that somebody is dedicated to them and they're not going to potentially leave them for somebody else. Now, I know the reality is that just because you're in a monogamous relationship doesn't mean that the person's never going to leave. However, again, it's how it feels to a person. So when you're in a monogamous relationship and you feel like the person's dedicated to you, you don't really have this sense that they could very easily end up with somebody else and then decide to leave your relationship. Whereas in a poly relationship, when you are already with multiple people, there is much more of a fear that, he's going to like that person better, or she's going to like that person better, or they're going to be better in bed, or they're going to whatever, and they're just going to want to go off and be on their own. So a benefit is that most people feel safer in a monogamous relationship. Another benefit of monogamous relationships is they are, in my personal opinion, the best way to raise children. So if raising children is something that you want to do, the context of a male and female together raising children in a safe monogamous relationship, I think honestly is the best environment for raising children. Children really need an environment that they perceive as being safe and stable, which are two of the characteristics that we associate more with monogamy. And they absolutely need a male role model and a female role model. Now, I know some people listening to this will disagree with that. I know there are a lot of people that feel that, say same-sex parents can do just as good a job as raising children as, a male and female. And I'm not saying that that's not true. And, I think that there are a lot of same-sex couples who adopt children who really need a good home and can provide that, and everything is perfectly fine. However, it is important for children growing up to have prominent masculine and feminine role models in their lives. That is, in those early years, how they learn to relate to either the opposite sex or even their own sex. And so getting those early imprints is really important. And I think in a stable monogamous relationship, I think that is really the safest and best place to raise children. Another positive of monogamous relationships is that they tend to have really good depth of connection, or at least they have the ability to have really good depth of connection. Now, I know poly people would argue with me and say you can have just as much depth in a poly relationship. Yes, you can, but it takes a significantly higher amount of work, right? You have to really work at it because there's only so much time in the day, right? And so, yes, you can have a high level of depth in a poly relationship, but it's generally easier for most people to have a really deep connection when they're focusing their time and attention on one person, especially in today's day and age where our lives are so busy and there are so many distractions and so much going on. It's like we barely have time for one partner nowadays, right? Now imagine if we're splitting that time across multiple partners. It definitely gets more challenging to really be able to go deep with somebody and really learn everything there is to know about a person and get to those deeper levels. Another positive of monogamy is that it is far less complex. It is much simpler than your typical polyamorous relationship. And obviously, simpler is generally easier to deal with. So, most people would find that as a plus. There are some people, and I do know these people, like I personally know some of these people, where relationship and relating is literally a hobby of theirs. Sometimes it's even a passion of theirs. That's partly how I came to be doing this sort of work, is I was around a lot of people who made mastering relationships a huge part of their lives. And so for people like that, it's like, hey, bring on the complexity because it's only helping me get better at this. And, my hobbies on the weekends are go to workshops and learn how to have great relationships, right? So for those people, okay, not really a big deal. But for the average person, that's not really where they want to be spending all of their time, is going to workshops and reading books and, figuring out how to fix some, complex relationship problem. In fact, most people cringe when they think about that fact, like, oh God, I don't ever want to deal with that, right? So, if that's you, a less complex monogamous relationship would probably suit your temperament better. And then lastly, obviously, jealousy is less of an issue. There's still plenty of people who get jealous in monogamous relationships. There are just less reasons, and jealousy issues tend to get stirred up less often in monogamous relationships. But what about the negatives of a monogamous relationship? Well, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes one partner refuses to meet the other partner's needs. And if you are committed to being in a monogamous relationship, what can you do about that? Some needs you can get met on your own, and some needs you can't. And so sometimes there are situations in monogamous relationships where one person ends up feeling like their needs are not met. Now, depending on what that need is, it might be a smaller need and you might be like, well, okay, I will just deal with that. But it might be a bigger need, and over time that can lead to resentment and possibly the person deciding that this is so important that they need to leave the relationship. And so it can end up often in ending of the relationship. Another potential negative to monogamy is that it can get stagnant if not properly cared for. And unfortunately, I see this a lot. Some of the reasons why people like to be in monogamous relationships are, like I said earlier, they're stable and they're safe, right? And so people will get into a monogamous relationship. They're like, okay, I got my person now. All is good. Boom, we just go on autopilot with life. But remember that relationships are living, breathing entities in and of themselves, and they require things just like any other living entity. So what do relationships require? They require time, they require energy, they require love, they require open minds, open hearts, right? Good communication, all of these things, nurturing, in order to keep them thriving and successful. And unfortunately, in monogamous relationships, a lot of times people tend to just kind of forget about those things and get complacent, and that leads to a lot of problems. That happens less often in the poly relationships because as soon as you start neglecting any one part of that relationship, it starts to fall apart, right? And then you're like, oh boy, I better do something. But monogamous relationships can tend to go on for long periods of time like that, and that can be a problem. And lastly, one of the negatives of monogamous relationships is that people tend to not take the time to really learn the higher level relationship skills. So it's kind of similar to stagnant, but stagnant can simply mean, you're not sharing appreciations as much as you used to, or you're not, taking your partner out on dates like you used to. But when I'm talking about, not learning the higher level skills, it's like you didn't learn how to communicate better because, well, it was good enough and it kind of worked. Maybe you didn't learn better sex skills because, well, it was kind of good enough and he or she's not really complaining, so whatever. Whereas in the poly relationships, not learning those skills usually results in a disaster. So they're forced to, otherwise the relationship doesn't continue. And so the downside for monogamy is that you can kind of get stuck in these ruts where things get stagnant and you are not putting in the energy to really become the best version of yourself as it pertains to being a partner in the relationship. So those are some of the pros and cons of polyamory versus monogamy. Are those an exhaustive list? No, of course not. You can come up with more pros, you can come up with more cons. It was just kind of like a high-level overview of some of the main things, some of the main differences. And I really wanted to include that in this video because I wanted people to know that there are options, there are choices. You don't have to choose one style over another. The only thing that's truly important is that both people are in, or if there's more than two, that everyone is in unanimous agreement about being in that style of relationship. So if you're in a monogamous relationship, both of you should feel like, yes, we want to be in a monogamous relationship. If you're in a polyamorous relationship, all parties involved should be like, yes, we want to be in a polyamorous relationship. And there can be a lot of factors that make you decide one over the other, some of which I've talked about in this video. And so when we come to answering the question, is man inherently monogamous or is man inherently polyamorous? Again, honestly, I don't think it's either one. I think that humans are great adapters, and I think that they choose what works best for them given the society and the time in which they are living. And there are examples, successful examples throughout history of both of them. So my advice to you as a sex, love, and relationship coach is to get really clear on what you want, what you need, what works for you, and then seek out a person or persons who want the same thing that you want. The problem with what happened recently that was out there in the public circle is that the man in this particular couple was the one saying he really wanted to be in a polyamorous relationship. But what people were hearing from the woman was, well, she wasn't so sure about it. And at first she was a no. And then she changed her mind. And now she decided that she wants to. I don't know what's true for her. Maybe that is the process she had to go through. Maybe she does really want to be in it now. I don't know. But it caused that stir because there was that mismatch there. And some people felt like he was sort of pushing her into it. I do not suggest that ever. You really have to be on the same page, and you have to both be in 100% agreement that this is the relationship style that we want and that works for us. All right, I hope that you found that helpful. As always, if you were looking for more of my work, please go to kevinanthonycoaching.com/link in bio. That is my link tree where you can find everything that I'm up to, from my online courses to my podcast, to this YouTube channel, to blog articles, to my coaching programs. It is all right there.